what I will say is, first and foremost, you need to make sure that you're establishing relationships with community, right? That first and foremost is the most important thing that you need to be focusing on if you're going to be doing community-driven archival work, period, is to either repair or establish a relationship with the community. And then once you get to that point, and sometimes those relationships can take years. Nancy has said to me and continues to build relationships with folks, and she's been here 12 years now, 11 years, and she's still establishing and trying to build relationships with folks 11 years into a career that she's had here at ASU. So it's not going to be an overnight thing that you are going to be able to, especially if that community has been very harmed by either your institution or institutions in general. As we, as Black and African American people know, institutions have harmed us very much. And so we need to make sure we're doing that work to repair those relationships or establish a relationship that is genuine and real, and that it is very much a part of your understanding that you are there to listen. That's it. You are there to listen. And if you can provide that support, financial support, like I said, we have a lot of things where we're giving free supplies to community. And that, I think, has really been an impactful part of the work that we're doing. So if you're doing this work at all, relationship building first and foremost, and then dig into resources that you as an institution have in order to spread that out to the community and spread that particular knowledge. And as a professionally trained archivist, somebody who went to a master's degree program, I am more than happy to impart my knowledge that I learned in my graduate program to people for free. I don't expect anything back in return where community is concerned if they're asking me to assist them in trying to build an archive or build something that is only for family or community. I never want people to think that I am doing anything for them that is going to be a quid, kind of like you need to provide something to me if I'm going to provide something to you. That is just not the talking point that you need to have where this is concerned. So do this work in a genuine way, show up in a genuine way, and that is how you are going to be able to do this work. And then provide, if you can, if you're an institution, provide free resources to community. Nancy, do you have anything else to add? Oh, yes. Our toolkit, we have a toolkit. I always forget about this. We have a toolkit on our website where we have uploaded all of our presentations that we did during our Archives 101 and community, scanning oral history workshops. So all of these resources are available for free for you and for others on our website, the Community Driven Archives Initiative website on ASU Libraries page. So please visit that under our resources tab that provides all of our information, all of our presentations, all of our booklets, all of the handouts that we give out during these workshops. All of that is available for free on our website in order for you to look at and adapt or do whatever you need to do in order to have that be a part of the work that you're doing with community.
There's another question.
Yes, please.
A little bit longer. There are some seats up front too. I know some people might be looking. I know it's close to the speakers, but that's okay. They don't bite.
I know we don't. We're very leveling up here. So please come and see us up front.
Come on up.
Yes, please come up in front.
Okay.
Go ahead, Shannon.
Question. It's a little bit long. This is from Justin Hardy, who is an assistant professor at the ASU School of Social Work. He said he's conducting research on Black contributions to social work and social welfare history, and he'd like to expand his service work at ASU to include historical service. Are there historical committees at the library that are non-library that a non-library faculty can join?
Yeah, not yet. I mean, so this again is part of the work that we're doing. We're trying to establish advisory councils and advisory groups. So if you are interested and want to be a part of an advisory council or group that is dedicated to community-driven archival work or oral history work, or an understanding of how Black and African American communities and people do work either within social work or any type of work, honestly, please reach out to us, because we would love to have that ability to work with folks outside of the library sphere in order to make sure that people understand and can do this work in whatever field that you are a part of. So Justin, please reach out to us. We would love to have a conversation with you about that. Okay. Our panelists are here. And I believe Anthony, is your mic on? Can you, and you might have to like pull it closer. These mics, I didn't realize that you have to literally put it like right almost up to your mouth, unfortunately. Yeah, sounds like, nope, I don't think yours is.
It may not. All right. No, let me begin. I apologize for my tardiness. You can ask a lot of people who know me. This is a thing, but I apologize for that. I
It's
felt
okay.
a lot of stress.
No, it's okay.
Today, but
You're fine. No worries.
thank you for that, and thank you for allowing me to inhabit this space with you all today.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so I am the moderator for this first panel, and I'm super excited to be able to talk to both of these scholars about the work that they're doing to preserve Arizona Black history. I'm going to go ahead and, okay, so introduction on my end. Hi, nice to see you again. Jessica Salow, Assistant Archivist, Black Collections here at ASU Library. I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves when I'm done reading the description. So I'm going to go ahead and read the description of this panel. Arizona's Black history dates back to the late 1800s, a fact most people don't know when it comes to the history of the United States. The voices and stories of Black Arizonans continue to be underrepresented within archival institutions. In this panel, Dr. Anthony Pratcher and Dr. Meskerem, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Say it one more time. Glegziabher. Ooh, okay, thank you. Discuss the work they are doing to correct the representation of Black communities within Arizona's historical record. So I'm going to pass it over to both of our panelists in order to go ahead and have them introduce themselves.
Can folks hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so as Jessica said, my name is Meskerem Glegziabher, Meski for short. I am assistant clinical professor here at Arizona State University School of Human Evolution and Social Change. I'm also the director for inclusion and community engagement for that unit. I'm trained as a sociocultural anthropologist and kind of fell into historical memory work just kind of as a passion project as an aside. I can talk a little bit more about my work later, but just as an introduction.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I don't think I feel well.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna.
It is okay, Anthony. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here, though. Hopefully you feel better. All right, Meski. So let's go ahead and talk about the work that you're doing. Go ahead. Thank you, Bruce. I really appreciate you, Todd. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Meski.
So as I mentioned a second ago, I'm trained as a sociocultural anthropologist, and all of my work in some way is interested in understanding belonging and the ways that sort of dominant narratives shape who can make legitimate claims to space and resources, and how those same narratives perpetuate marginalization and uphold structural inequality. I try to identify ways that sort of at a micro scale, we can disrupt or mitigate that, or at the very least expose those inequities. My focus on Black history and heritage in Arizona in particular started from my own desire to sort of see more folks who looked like me when I moved here 9 years ago. I kind of showed up. I'm kind of an urban nomad. I've lived in 9 different cities and 3 different continents. And all of the cities that I'd lived in within the US proper before I moved here had kind of a minimum of 25% or so Black population. So when I got here, it became very visible to me that I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me around. And then I would ask people albeit a very sort of limited sample, and that most of the people that I knew were associated with the university or my neighbors. Where are some, local Black, neighborhoods or communities where I could connect? And I kept getting these answers of like, oh, there isn't really a well-established Black community here, or most Black folks here are transplants, and et cetera. And I had no actual knowledge of this, but it just rang false to me. I'm like, that doesn't sound right. So I just started digging. And I met Clotty Hammonds, who a lot of you probably know in this room, at a local event, vinyl, something in vinyl. I can't remember what it was called, at the Coronado. And she was talking about being sort of having these sort of long roots here in Arizona. And I said, okay, so this is the person I need to talk to. And so she and I partnered up a few years back to, she had kind of this very large, all-encompassing project that she called Indiscernibles in Arizona, the Great Migration, and was interested in doing an exhibit. And my department was had just, I think, I can't think of her name now, but the author of The Warmth of Other Suns had just come to do a talk here. And my director was very excited about the possibility of talking about the Great Migration and the idea of Arizona. So I said, okay, so what if we can figure out how to use those resources that are available in our unit to work with the communities, particularly Clotty's project. And so she and I collaborated together to create this traveling exhibit about the history of sort of the migration of Black folks into Arizona. And, she had a lot of connections with the community, elders in particular. And I was able to do a lot of the archival work to support that exhibit, and then also had some connections with local high schools. And so we paired high school students at South Mountain High School with some elders that Clotty knew, and had them do oral history interviews. And then we paired those with some of the archival work that I'd done, albeit that's also the other moment where I had this sort of shocking realization that there was very, very little in the actual archives. And even sort of the Greater Arizona collections, if you put in sort of as a subject tag African American or Black, I think 9 popped up across the 500 collections. And then in those, very few of those were directly dealing with, right? Like they were in passing or tangential, right? And oftentimes it would be sort of the few names that popped up over and over again, the very well-known sort of the Lincoln Ragsdales, et cetera. And in terms of just sort of average folks that were from Arizona or lived here, there wasn't that much going on. And so during that process, it became very clear that there's this dearth in the official archives. But also during that process, a lot of the elders that I met that were being interviewed, it became very clear that they all were doing their own kind of memory work, right? One of the participants in that oral history project, Mr. Rod Grimes, had he shared this thumb drive with me where he was putting together something for sort of like the centennial of his family of when they arrived in Arizona, and had something like 500 slides and images, and he'd done all of this work just independently, right? So there was a very clear sort of gap between the knowledge that resided within the community, right, and what was in the official history books or in the official archives. So anyway, this exhibit was great. And one of the other things that we tried to do in that exhibit, aside from the sort of the oral histories and the archival work, was try to incorporate everyday things, right? And talk about how those are artifacts, those are part of our history, right? So when I think oftentimes people think about items or objects or artifacts in museums or exhibits, there's this idea that they're very separate from sort of everyday objects. So some of the things that we displayed during this exhibit were, one of our participants shared, let us borrow 100-year-old lace tablecloth that she had gotten from her grandmother. There were bunt pans that had been passed down from mothers and grandmothers. There were ladles, recipes, things like that. So, and also, we had sort of this like a thing that one of our, I don't know how to describe it. I'm clearly not the the artistic director of the exhibit, but our creative director and exhibits manager at the time, Marco Albarran, is a great artist, and he put together this sort of dried out cotton plant as a sort of an homage to all of the laborers around the cotton farms that had been actively recruited during the early 20th century. So anyway, so that was sort of this exhibit, and we wanted to ensure that, yes, it was great that it lived at the ASU at our gallery for a few months, but that wasn't its home, right? So the ownership of that from the very beginning was with Clotie and her organization, and that it would travel to the community and other places around the valley. It went to the Rawson House in Heritage Square after that, and I think she's taken it a few other places. And that particular exhibit and that project, I think, was a really great launching pad for Clotie's project, the broader project, in that, you know, she connected with, I think, the humanities, got some grant there, put together an anthology. This just sort of kept growing. I recently, and then sort of another thing that became clear, I'm expanding more because I feel like I have more, we have more time now. This was not the original. I wasn't planning on getting that in depth in my description originally. I recently was able to publish this article in the Journal of Arizona History called Where All the Black Folks, you know, Erasure Narrative and of Black History in Arizona. And in connection to that, I did sort of a very short radio interview. And what happened to that as a result of that was that all of a sudden I got all of these people saying, oh, I've been doing this on my own. I have all this information. And it's been this wealth of just like folks reaching out. It was amazing. Literally by 7 a.m. the day it came out, I had like at least 6 or 7 emails already. And that's been incredible, in that it's sort of spawned this other sort of very nascent project that I've been now sort of talking to and connecting with several other folks that are, like I said, already doing the work. I've kind of piggybacked on and joined with Dr. Marta Berbes and this work that she's been doing with the Blackwards to the Future project that was initiated in conversations between her and Mr. Perry Elam and Ms. Liz Woody, who are the co-founders of Black Wall Street, Arizona. And that's kind of, like I said, it's very, very early in the sense of sort of my involvement in that project, although that project itself started in 2017 before the untimely death of Mr. Perry Elam. But what that particular project is doing is sort of, it's inspired, like the naming, I love the name, right? Blackwards to the Future. But what it's sort of getting inspiration for the Adinkra concept of Sankofa, right? And this project seeks to sort of document oral histories of elders of the Black communities of Phoenix in order to capture the quote unquote what was, and then bring it into conversation with future visions of Black youth to reveal quote unquote what ought to be, right? So, and the idea is that it uses sort of the past to guide the inspiration for the future of sort of local Black communities. And its initial, I mean, in these conversations, we've had like 50 million ideas of things that it could, you know, potential outputs, right? Walking tours and digital story maps and all of these things. But sort of the 3 that we're currently focused on is first to take stock of the existing materials that are in the communities already, and to help develop a community-driven archive with the support around proper preservation practices and cataloging from Jessica and the Black collections. And then the second is sort of imagining Black-centric futures through a series of encounters between youth and elders, and potentially looking at things like speculative fiction and writing and sort of artistic workshops and things like that, but pairing again youth and elders in that practice. And then the third is sort of going back to the origin of what the Blackwards to the Future project was, which was kind of an oral history project trying to document the lives of some elders in South Phoenix and the community. And so to co-produce a short documentary film that captures those oral histories, and then also sort of brings in those encounters with youth as well. So it's not only an oral history sort of documentary, but it pairs that whole project together. So those are just some of the more firm outputs, although like I said, I've been having conversations with so many people. I recently met with Summer Sherland over at South Mountain Community College, and they have the South Mountain Oral History Project that they launched, which is really great. Conversations with Chandra and some of the work that they're trying to think about in terms of preservation of the East Lake Park area. There's so many people that are doing all this work. And I think, again, sort of one of the things I highlight in the article and that I think is really important is that there's a tendency when things are missing from the official quote unquote archives, this idea that one, it doesn't exist, or that some outsider needs to come in and, uncover, discover, whatever, sort of Columbus the situation. And that is clearly not what needs to happen. What needs to happen is to, again, provide whatever resources and support we can to sort of the existing work that's already being done among individuals within the families, and then sort of spotlight that or support that. And then in doing so, make sure that we're not, again, co-opting it, whatever the ownership and all of that stuff needs and is very important to remain within the communities. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It feels like there's so much intersection in a lot of the work that we both are doing. And I think a lot of intersection in general with a lot of the work that different units and departments within ASU are doing. And I'm happy that you all have decided to take on this work and to do it in the way that is, as you talked about, beneficial to the community and the people who belong in that community and have those stories in community. For me, it feels like, Black collections is, I don't want to say that, I can kind of be, just kind of like, again, another part of the team, right? Because I'm very excited that you're working with Marta, because Blackwords is one of those projects that deserves to have the attention that it needs in order to make sure that they are doing, or that they're having the output that they want. But then at the same time, we all have the same goal in preserving and making sure that Arizona's Black history is known and that it is something that folks within that community can do and take pride in. And not that they're not taking pride in it, but to also just realize, as the description says, we have been here, we continue to be here, and will always be here. And so for folks not to realize and to understand that we've been here since the 1800s. We've been here at ASU. Our first Black graduate, we'll talk about that in the ASU Black history. Our first Black graduate here at ASU was in 1924, right? So we've had Black graduates from this institution since the 1920s. Do most people know that? I don't think they do, right? And so for us to come together and to have that ability to, as an institution, work together within the institution, and then to also branch out into the projects that community are already doing and how we can assist in providing that support that is needed sometimes to get them to that next step, I think is really, really, really important. So I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I mean, I'm for a long time, I think early on, I felt, again, like you said, because it's so important that it be community driven and sort of kind of like an interloper. And this, I just got here in 2014. But again, I think I went to a talk a few years ago by a scholar from Chicago. I can't think, I have these moments where my brain just goes blank on people that I know very well. And I can't think of his name right now, but he made a comment about the fact that he became a professor and got into sort of connected to these institutions purely as a way to, for lack of a better word, siphon resources back to his community, right? He was like, that is the whole purpose. Like, that is my point. And so the idea, I think that's kind of where I've landed, that like, yes, I don't have I don't have very deep roots in Arizona, but what I do have is a connection to an institution that has resources. And if there is a way for me to sort of connect those resources with communities in a way that's not sort of co-opting that narrative or sort of trying to put myself at the center of that story, then I think it's my responsibility to do that. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel that same way. So it's an honor and a privilege to get to know you and to get to see the work that you're doing. And as I've been telling folks and will continue to tell folks, please let me know how I can help in the projects and in the work that you're doing. If you're in ASU and if you're outside of ASU, right? I want to make sure that I am expanding and providing as much as I possibly can to the community when it comes to resources, when it comes to the understanding of Black history within Arizona specifically, and how that work connects to, you know, the healing and the ability for folks to tell genuine, true stories about their experience, you know, and how that is connected to the larger understanding of history and culture and what that means to folks who are centered specifically in Arizona, because I'm also not a native of Arizona. And it feels like a lot of times, and I understand this, right? I understand the Arizona Black community being protective of their history and of their culture. And so for me to be connected to an institution that can provide, you know, either financial or resources or other means of support means a lot to me to when I have Native Arizonans, Native Black Arizonans come up to me and say, you are doing really great work and that the work that you're doing is making an impact. So again, really appreciative of you. So we have some time. So I have some questions for you. So, and we'll get to a Q&A section here that folks can ask Mesky a question, or myself if you want to ask me more questions. But my first question to you is, and I always put one of these words in quotes. So how hard has it been to uncover and document Arizona Black and African American history?
So I think I covered a little bit of it when I was talking about it earlier. And I think the difficulty came initially in making connections to community, right? Because in the official archives, it's just not there. I think there was like the Matrix Project, Arizona Matrix Project or something, put out a stat that said that Black folks are reflected in only 1% of the state archives. So, and then again, a lot of people don't know, but when I was asking those questions of like, oh, where are some communities? I think the references were either there aren't any, or I would get sort of a nod towards, I think, 3 institutions, the Carver Museum, AME Tanner Church, and then Mrs. White's Golden Rule Cafe. That was the 3. And it's like, and that's not to dismiss what those institutions are and have been to the community, right? But there's clearly more happening here than just those 3 institutions. And so I think initially the connections were the thing that was lacking. I think as soon as I started actually meeting people who are from here or have a long history here, like I said, folks have a lot of information. They've all been collecting it, whether it's through oral histories, whether it's like photographs. And one of my favorite pastimes in terms of like having conversations with sort of older, particularly retired folks is that they have the time and they have all the stories, and they're like, oh, let me show you my family album, or let me show you these pictures. So once those connections were made, the quote unquote uncovering or whatever wasn't that difficult. I think what I always try to use when I talk about sort of the lack of this information in the official books or whatever is that's why I try to use the term erasure, right? It's a willful forgetting. It's not that information isn't available or out there somewhere. It's that there's sort of between the active sort of whitewashing of history, right? Like, so when people are talking about even like popular culture and references to the American West, the sort of the storied cowboys being all white or whatever, or the active, like, movies in the John Wayne movies or whatever, actively casting real historic Black cowboys with white actors, right? Like, this is an active erasure in the same way that sort of the physical erasures that have been happening, right? So in 2004, there was a survey that was done, the African American Property Survey, that was commissioned by the city, And it was, a group of Black folks from the community did this amazing survey, and they identified 100 and I want to say 197 or something properties that were of relevance or importance to historic Black communities, ranging all the way back from 1870 to 1971, I think was the range. And in the interim, 97 of those have been demolished. So, and there was all these sort of technicalities around why they didn't meet whatever the criteria for, whatever historical preservation or whatever was. But what that means is that there's a physical erasure that's happening of historic sites, places like the Rice Hotel or the Booker T. Washington Memorial Hospital, et cetera. And then you have the sort of discursive erasure that happens around the narratives around the West was, white cowboys or whatever. And this other narrative around Black folks being new arrivals or transplants. And then it not only erases Black folks from the history of Arizona, but then it kind of doesn't give those same communities kind of a leg to stand on when they make claims about shaping the future of Arizona, right? So you just got here, you're not really whatever. So like, there's no, this idea that like, they don't really have a say or get a say about what happens to sort of around development in East Lake, for example, or whatever, like all that stuff. Municipal corporations or whoever, the powers that be, when they're doing these community town halls or whatever, don't necessarily feel beholden, right, to this community or to these communities, because there's not this idea that they have a quote unquote legitimate claim. Right. So yeah, I think I got on a tangent.
No,
Sorry.
that's fine. And I appreciate tangents because again, this is a part of the work, right? And the understanding that so much has been suppressed and so much has been whitewashed and erased that we literally have to go on our soapbox or on a tangent in order to make sure that folks know the long and storied history of these communities and the active, again, erasure and destruction of a lot of this stuff. And so I'm looking at the time and it looks like we're pretty close to the end of the panel. So I wanted to go ahead and open it up for Q&A for Mesky or for myself. If you all have any questions for her, Shannon or Nancy, thank you. We have some hands. I see some hands.
So, hi, Jessica and
Closer.
Mesky. Thank you so much for closer. Okay,
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
It's like
Okay.
you got to get like real close.
I just love this conversation though, because I'm a native Arizonan and I want to know more about, I've never lived anywhere else and I don't know what other communities are like, but Central Arizona is so sort of fractured in a way. I grew up in Tucson. Tucson was a little more closer knit, but here in Phoenix, it seems like there's just your communities kind of stay in your communities and don't move outside your little bubble and you don't move around. And I feel like it's kind of always been that way here. And so that makes it so much harder to do this kind of work because it has been erased and it hasn't been talked about. And so we just, for me as a genealogist too, it's the community work. The family stories are what we need in the record to fill that gap in and make people realize that, yes, these communities have been here from the beginning. And I'm just kind of curious about other places. What kind of work have you seen in places that you've come from that people are doing, and what can we incorporate here that we can do more of to bring those communities together? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Jennifer Mary, Arizona Historical Society, Library and Archives.
So I'm probably not going to be a great resource to you here, primarily because, like I said, I'm not actually a historian or an archivist, right? I'm trained as an anthropologist.
Right.
And so, and I kind of fell into this, right? There are, a lot of things in my own training that were complementary to the work. I was able to train the high school students in doing oral history interviews because I do that in my ethnography, but it wasn't, I wasn't trained as a historian. I have great students that do community driven sort of archive work. And maybe, folks can connect outside of that too, but I think I'll pass this along to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that question. And, I didn't start doing this work until I came to Arizona. But as I said, I've had conversations with a lot of people who have either come to events or I've met at conferences who are specifically in the library and information science field, who are very interested in community-driven archival work, because as I said in my opening and in my introduction, that traditional archives have really harmed Black and African American communities, and so that active erasure from the historical record is real and it's relevant. And I think the more we as Black and African American people within this profession talk about that active erasure and showing up in the way that we are doing for our communities is going to do a lot. And so specifically, you know, to answer your specific question, relationship building, right? Like that all on its own can create so much for folks if you're doing this work. And so I encourage every one of you, if you are interested in this work, to really start realizing and understanding and figuring out how to build relationships with community and with people within those communities, because as Mesky has pointed out, like you get introduced to one native Arizonan, and I've met, there's a bunch of y'all in this room, and once I meet one of you, I meet like 6 of you, and then I learn so much from native Black Arizonans, because there are so many folks who are wanting to talk about the history here, wanting to talk about their community, their people, the understanding of us being here forever. And so build those relationships, talk to folks, make sure, again, if you're a part of an institution and that institution has come in and historically erased that community, you say sorry. You have to say sorry. Like that is a part of it as well. And so just to be real and to be honest, and for me, that has worked in the work that I have been doing.
Hello, I'm Paige. I'm a master's student here at ASU in the Shippers Department, and I focus on the Nation of Islam, trying to look at the history here in Arizona for the Nation of Islam, and then looking that in the framework of the Black Power movement. So along these lines of, like, even in the introduction from the earlier, not panel, but you know what I mean, looking at the erasure and the exclusion of Black history here. And then I think you said only like still 86% of archivists are white. And so when you have a white person who is interested in doing this work, are there ways to, like, how do I want to word this? Like where you kind of teach them how to be mindful or like to do care work when they're doing this? I know there was the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia with the anti-racist description resources, but when you're doing the sessions and stuff where you're doing the hands-on and you're teaching them, like, are there ways of teaching white people how to center Black lives without putting the epistemology of Eurocentric modes of knowledge on it?
You want to answer that, Mesky?
I mean, there are a lot of people who do that work. I don't do that work. I think ultimately I feel like I'm not very helpful in these answers so far, but I think always I'm going to take a step back. So I did this, I was reading Lee Patel's work on decolonizing education. And one of the things that she says is like so there's like this distinction between sort of community engaged and community accountable, right? And asking the question, honestly speaking, and this might be very hard for somebody that's like halfway through their career or whatever training they are, is ask yourself why you want to do that work. Like, why is that the story? Not that not to question whether or not that story needs to be told, but why are you the person that needs to tell that story, right? And just because I'm interested in it is not necessarily a good enough answer, in my opinion. So starting from there and like really reflecting on motivations, your own both skill set and capacity, like and even if you get to the point where like, okay, I think whatever my answer for that question of why I want to do it is valid, then ask the question, do I have the skills, the relationships, the whatever it is that I will be able to do this work justice, right? Like that I can do it in a way that is respectful or whatever. And so then sort of asking those questions, and then also, and maybe this isn't super popular opinion considering we're sort of talking about building up archives, but also like if you're doing archival work for an institution, for example, does this institution deserve that information? Right? Like that just because like ASU has the resources or whatever, that doesn't mean that like a particular community's history or archives or whatever story needs to be housed there, right? Again, considering all of the historical harm that's been done, all of that stuff. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I feel like for a very long time, the approach from sort of scholars has always been that like, oh, of course I can go and help. Like it has this sort of like savior, whatever tint to it. And sort of taking a moment, and I think we talk a lot about sort of positionalities become a thing where people talk about, this is my positionality. I'm 100% for doing that reflective work, but just stating where your intersections are doesn't absolve you then to move forward to do that work, right? So you have to actually say, should I be the person doing this work? Do I have the capacity to be able to do the work in a way that does it justice? And who is the audience? And does that audience deserve this work? Like, am I actually putting more harm or sort of a target or whatever on this community by putting that information out there? I think this came up, a little bit of it came up in that STAND symposium, which we did a few years ago about student activism and archiving and documenting that, and the type of harm that could come from documenting protest work when they start arresting protesters or whatever, right? Like the archives can be used as evidence, right, to actually harm those communities. So thinking about like a long view of like, what is my work? What can not just what you want to do with that work, but can my work be taken and used in a way that can harm the community?
I would just say ditto to literally everything Mesky just said. I know we're a little bit over on our panel, but I just want to say also that empathy and having the cultural competency and understanding of, as a white person walking into a community, you know, is really important. And I think what Mesky just said is also greatly important, because again, you don't want to show up into a community and have them, you know, be like, oh, it's just another white person who's trying to take my history, right? And so you have to really humble yourselves in a lot of respect if you're a non-Black person walking into a Black community or family and asking to preserve their history. So you have to be very humble in, as Mesky said, the understanding of why you're doing this work and what is that going to do to that community or to that family if you are going to take on this project and really, you know, try to do you know, cultural work or ethnic work that is outside of your ethnic or racial you know, I want to say understanding, but who you are as a person in your particular thing. So yes, this is the end of this panel. Thank you all so very much. We really appreciate you, and we're sending our best to Dr. Anthony Pratcher, and thank you. We're going to set up for our second panel. We'll be right back.